I've been in love with flowers since I was a kid, so one day, when I stumbled upon a vendor at the market I approached. He ended up being the love of my life, and eventually we married and lived happily together. I've always been a little obsessed with flowers. My earliest memory is sitting in my grandmother's backyard, surrounded by marigolds, thinking nothing in the world could be as beautiful. I'd spend hours pressing petals into old books, trying to save them forever. Friends used to joke that I'd either open a flower shop or marry someone who owned one, and they weren't far off. It started the spring after my 27th birthday. I'd just moved into a small apartment above a bookstore in a quiet part of town, fresh from a rough breakup. Reinventing my space felt therapeutic, and I wanted it to feel like a little greenhouse. So, I began visiting the Saturday farmers market religiously. One cool morning after a spring rain, I wandered past bread stalls and jars of honey until I saw it, an explosion of color under a striped yellow and white tent. Buckets of ranunculus, peonies, tulips, sunflowers, all arranged like someone had painted them into reality. Behind the table stood a man in a rolled-up denim shirt, hands dusted with pollen, and a smile warmer than the flowers. He looked up from tying a bouquet and said, "Looking for anything special, or just browsing for happiness?" I laughed. Happiness, mostly. Maybe something to make my apartment smell like spring. He handed me pale pink ranunculus mixed with eucalyptus. These will last longer than roses and open beautifully in sunlight. When I paid, he tucked a small card inside, his name, Eli, the words local grower, and a tiny pressed daisy laminated in the corner. I didn't think much of it until the next weekend, when I found myself at the same stall, pretending I needed fresh flowers but really just wanting to see him again. The second Saturday was warmer, and the market buzzed with people carrying tote bags overflowing with vegetables and baked goods. I spotted Eli's tent from across the street, sunlight hitting the buckets of flowers, so they almost glowed. He looked up mid-conversation with another customer, and when his eyes met mine, he grinned like he'd been expecting me. "Back for happiness?" he asked as I approached. "Maybe," I said, pretending to glance over the flowers. "Or maybe I'm just here to see if you have anything new." He reached for a bunch of deep orange tulips, their petals curled slightly at the edges. "These came in this morning. They'll brighten up your place." I bought them, but this time I lingered. He told me his family owned a small flower farm about 30 minutes outside of town. They grew everything themselves, rotating crops seasonally, and sold only at local markets. I learned he'd taken over most of the work after his dad's back injury a few years ago, and that he liked experimenting with less common blooms, things people wouldn't expect to see. Before I left, he asked, "Do you like peonies?" "They're my favorite," I said without hesitation. "Come by in 2 weeks," he replied, "and I'll have something for you." I spent the next 14 days counting down, partly for the flowers, but mostly because I couldn't stop thinking about him. Something about his presence felt grounded, like talking to him was its own kind of calm. When I returned, he handed me a bouquet of pink and white peonies so fragrant I could smell them before I even reached the tent. There was another little laminated card tucked inside, this one with a tiny pressed forget-me-not. "Thought you might like to start a collection," he said with a smirk. I didn't realize it yet, but those flowers were about to change my entire life. After that day, visiting Eli's stall became part of my routine. It wasn't just about the flowers anymore, it was the way the colors seemed to spill into my week, brightening even the most ordinary moments. My apartment slowly transformed into a miniature garden. Every surface had a jar, vase, or repurposed bottle holding something new. Pale lisianthus, creamy dahlias, buttery yellow freesias. Eli had a way of choosing blooms that matched the mood of the season. In early summer, my kitchen smelled like lavender and mint. By mid-July, it was sunflowers and zinnias, bold and unapologetic. The laminated cards kept coming, each with a different pressed flower sealed inside. I kept them in a small wooden box on my bookshelf. I learned more about him in bits and pieces. His mornings began before sunrise at the farm, tending rows of plants while the air was still cool. He worked with his younger sister, who managed most of the arrangements, and his mother, who knew every Latin name by heart. The farm, he told me once, had been in the family for 3 generations. Even without long conversations, there was a quiet familiarity growing between us. He would greet me with a nod and a half-smile that felt like it was meant just for me. Sometimes, if I arrived early, I would watch him work, carefully stripping leaves from stems, arranging them with an artist's patience. One Saturday in late August, I stopped by his stall to find a bouquet already waiting at the corner of the table. It was a mix of cosmos, snapdragons, and sprigs of rosemary. The card inside had no words, just a tiny pressed heart-shaped clover. That was the first time I wondered if these flowers were more than just flowers. By the time autumn rolled in, my Saturday trips to the market felt less like errands and more like rituals. The air carried the faint chill of change, and the flowers at Eli's stall shifted to match: rich burgundy dahlias, burnt orange mums, golden marigolds. My apartment became a reflection of the season, each bouquet marking the slow turning of time. The laminated cards had grown into a small stack. Each pressed flower seemed to hold a quiet message. I didn't fully understand them, but I could feel the care behind every one. I started to look forward to them as much as the blooms themselves. One afternoon, I stayed longer than usual at the market, wandering through other stalls before heading home. When I passed Eli's tent again, the crowd had thinned, and I noticed how he carefully packed up the unsold flowers, wrapping them so they wouldn't bruise during the trip back. There was a tenderness in the way he handled them, as though each stem had a story worth protecting. That evening, I set his latest bouquet, deep red celosia and sprigs of sage, on my dining table. The scent filled the apartment, warm and grounding. As I arranged the stems, I realized I had begun structuring my life around these moments. The flowers weren't just decoration anymore. They were markers of connection, silent conversations unfolding week by week. By November, the market had fewer vendors, but Eli was always there, bundled in layers, his stall bright against the gray sky. I noticed he had begun making smaller arrangements just for me, combinations I hadn't seen him sell to anyone else. The latest one included a single stem of amaranth, its deep crimson drooping gracefully over the edge of the vase. The card inside held a pressed white camellia. Later, I would learn what that meant. At the time, I only knew it felt important. Winter arrived quietly, wrapping the town in muted tones. The farmer's market shrank to a fraction of its summer size, most stalls closing until spring. Eli's tent, however, remained, a small island of color against the frost. His selection changed with the season, shifting to hardy blooms, evergreens, and dried arrangements that could outlast the cold. My visits became less about filling my apartment with fresh flowers and more about holding onto a piece of warmth. I would watch his breath cloud in the air as he worked, his hands bare despite the chill, moving with practiced ease as he wrapped stems in brown paper. Each bouquet seemed like a small act of defiance against winter's gray. The cards didn't stop. If anything, they became more deliberate. Pressed sprigs of pine, dried lavender, even tiny clusters of berries appeared inside them. I began to look up the meanings of each flower, falling down rabbit holes of Victorian florography. Some meanings were clear, lavender for calm, pine for resilience. Others were more mysterious, like a dried blue cornflower that I later discovered symbolized hope and love. In late January, I caught myself lingering by his stall longer than I needed to, not because I was browsing, but because the quiet between us felt comfortable. The market was nearly empty that morning, the sound of snow crunching under boots replacing the usual chatter. I noticed how his eyes softened when he handed me the bouquet, as though he knew something neither of us had said aloud. That night, I placed the flowers, a mix of hellebores and silver brynia, on my kitchen counter. Their muted colors seemed perfectly suited to winter, understated but enduring. I tucked the latest card into my growing collection and wondered how long this thread between us had been quietly weaving itself into something more. February brought a brief thaw, the kind that tricks you into thinking spring is near. The market felt a little livelier that Saturday, with more vendors setting up and the faint scent of baked bread drifting through the air. Eli's stall looked as it always did. Orderly rows of buckets, paper-wrapped bundles ready for hands to carry them away. When I arrived, he already had a bouquet set aside. Soft blush roses, pale stock, and dusty miller, muted but elegant, like something pulled from an old painting. As I reached for my wallet, he didn't immediately hand it over. Instead, he hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper. I was wondering, he began, eyes not quite meeting mine, if you'd like to grab coffee sometime. Outside the market. The air seemed to hold still for a moment. It wasn't unexpected, not really, but hearing it made something warm unfurl in my chest. I nodded before I could overthink it. I'd like that. His smile was small, but it lingered as he finally passed me the bouquet. Inside was a card with a pressed sprig of myrtle. I didn't need to look it up to know its meaning: love and commitment. We met the following Wednesday at a small cafe near the river. Without the market between us, Eli seemed both familiar and entirely new. He spoke more freely, telling me about the long days on the farm, his plans for planting season, and the way he'd started keeping certain flowers aside, just in case I showed up. By the time we parted, the sky was fading into the soft colors of evening. I walked home with the faint scent of coffee and roses clinging to my coat, realizing that something had quietly shifted. The flowers had been the beginning, but now there was something growing between us that no vase could contain. After that first coffee, seeing Eli outside the market became part of my week. Sometimes it was another cafe meetup, other times a walk through the park with paper cups of tea. Conversation came easily, but there were also stretches of comfortable quiet where we simply observed the world together. Bare trees against the winter sky, the slow ripple of the river, the way stray leaves clung stubbornly to the grass. At the market, our dynamic shifted. Where before there had been an unspoken distance between vendor and customer, now there was a subtle familiarity. He would greet me with a smile that carried the memory of our last conversation, and the bouquets seemed even more personal. Every arrangement felt like it had been built just for me, a private language of color and scent. One Saturday in March, I arrived to find his stall overflowing with early spring blooms, anemones, hyacinths, and delicate hellebores in soft pinks and purples. He was mid-arrangement, hands moving quickly, but he glanced up when he saw me and set the bouquet aside. From under the table, he pulled a jar filled with water and a single branch of flowering quince, its coral blossoms just beginning to open. It was the simplest thing he'd ever given me, yet somehow the most striking. The card inside held a pressed violet, its color deep and rich. Later, I'd learned that violets symbolized faithfulness, but even without that knowledge, I understood the sentiment. The days began to warm, and our coffee meetings sometimes turned into late afternoon strolls through the neighborhood, where we'd point out other people's gardens and speculate about what might be planted next. I realized I had started looking forward to his company more than anything else in my week. The flowers were still beautiful, still a gift, but now they were a bridge, one that was slowly leading me somewhere I wasn't afraid to go. The seasons turned again, each one marked by the flowers Eli placed in my hands. Summer brought sunflowers and wild snapdragons, autumn returned with russet dahlias and marigolds, and winter wrapped us in pine, holly, and dried lavender. Our lives had woven together so seamlessly that I could barely remember a time when he wasn't part of my week. By the time spring came back around, it had been a full year since that first rainy market morning when I wandered into his stall. The anniversary felt unspoken yet understood between us. On the exact weekend the peonies returned, he asked if I wanted to take a drive out to the farm. I'd never been there before, and the idea of seeing where all those bouquets began filled me with quiet excitement. The farm stretched out in neat rows, the earth dark and freshly turned. Early blooms dotted the fields, their colors soft against the pale spring sky. He showed me the greenhouse, the drying shed, even the small table where he pressed the flowers for my cards. As we walked toward the far edge of the field, I noticed a single wooden bench under a blooming cherry tree. A bouquet rested on it, pink peonies, ranunculus, and sprigs of eucalyptus, just like the first one he'd ever given me. My fingers brushed the paper wrapping, and I saw there was a card tucked inside. This one wasn't laminated. Inside, instead of a pressed flower, was a small handwritten note. "Will you marry me?" When I turned, he was already kneeling in the grass, holding a simple ring. The world felt still except for the soft rustle of petals overhead. I said yes before my voice could even steady. The flowers had brought me to him, but it was everything in between, the quiet moments, the small gestures, that had made me stay. The weeks after our engagement passed in a warm blur. News traveled quickly through the market, and it seemed as though every vendor had something to say. Congratulations from the baker, a teasing wink from the cheese seller, a basket of strawberries for the happy couple from the fruit stand. Eli's stall became a small hub of celebration, each bouquet somehow brighter than the last. We decided to hold the wedding at the farm in early summer, when the fields would be bursting with blooms. Planning it there felt right. It was where his heart had always been, and where our story had quietly rooted itself long before we noticed. Instead of hiring a florist, we chose to use whatever was in season, letting the farm itself dictate the colors and textures. On the morning of the wedding, I arrived early to help arrange the flowers. Buckets of fresh-cut stems filled the air with a sweetness so thick it felt tangible. Eli's sister wove garlands of greenery for the tables, while his mother arranged centerpieces of peonies, roses, and delicate Queen Anne's lace. It was chaos in the most beautiful way, hands busy, laughter spilling into the open air, petals scattered across wooden tables. When it was time, we stood under the cherry tree where he had proposed. The branches were heavy with blossoms, their pale petals drifting down like confetti. He looked at me the way he always had in the market, steady, warm, as though nothing else existed. The vows came easily, though neither of us spoke in elaborate phrases. It was enough to promise the same constancy that had carried us through the past year. Small gestures, quiet care, and always flowers. When we walked back down the aisle, friends tossed handfuls of petals, the scent of them rising into the sunlight. It felt less like the start of something new and more like the natural bloom of something that had been growing all along. Married life began, without the sharp edge of change. It felt like slipping into something we'd already been wearing for months, familiar, comfortable, yet still full of quiet wonder. I moved into the farmhouse, where the smell of fresh earth and cut stems seemed to live in the walls. Mornings started earlier than they ever had in my life, with sunlight spilling over the fields and Eli already outside, checking on the rows of flowers. I learned quickly that the rhythm of the farm was its own kind of clock. Spring meant planting and endless weeding, summer was long days of cutting and arranging, autumn was harvesting and preparing for the cold, and winter was quiet work, drying blooms, pressing petals, planning the next season's crops. Each day ended with a bouquet on the kitchen table, even if it was just a handful of whatever was left over from the market. The box of laminated pressed flowers grew, but now there were new additions, little notes left in coat pockets, or blooms tucked into the corner of my journal. It became our way of speaking without words. Sometimes, on market days, I would stand behind the stall with him, tying bouquets for customers. People would smile at us, not knowing our story, but sensing something in the way we moved around each other, passing scissors without asking, reaching for the same bucket of flowers, exchanging glances that carried whole conversations. On quieter evenings, we'd walk through the fields as the sun set, the air humming with crickets. Eli would point out the beds where certain flowers had been planted for generations, explaining how his grandfather had chosen this soil, this land, for its richness. I would listen, feeling the weight of the history we were now part of. It wasn't just that I'd married the man who sold me flowers. It was that I'd stepped into a life where love itself was grown, tended, and shared. Update: it's been a little over 4 years since I first posted about the man at the farmer's market who sold me flowers. Back then, I had no idea how completely my life was about to change. Now, I'm writing this from our kitchen table at the farmhouse, looking out over rows of dahlias swaying in the breeze, with a mug of coffee in one hand and the smell of fresh-cut stems drifting in through the open window. Life has settled into a rhythm I never imagined for myself. The seasons mark time more than a calendar does. Spring brings planting and early blooms. Summer is an explosion of color and long market days. Autumn is rich and golden, and winter is quiet but never empty. We've expanded the farm, added a second greenhouse, and even started offering workshops where people can come and make their own bouquets. Watching others fall in love with flowers the way I did has been unexpectedly emotional. The box of pressed flowers Eli started for me is now overflowing. Each card is labeled with the date and the type of bloom, and sometimes I flip through them like a photo album. They've become our way of keeping a living record, not just of the flowers, but of the life we've built. We still make time for slow walks through the fields, even during the busiest weeks. Some evenings we'll just stand and watch the sunset over the rows, not saying much, because we don't have to. The quiet says enough. People still ask how we met, and every time, I smile. I tell them the truth. It started with flowers. But what I don't always say is that it's never just been about the flowers. It's about the man who grew them, the way he's grown with me, and how together we've made something worth tending every single day.